welcome back. As we said earlier in the show, perhaps one of the most controversial topics that it would be at the top of anyone's mind when you think of why the system isn't working, why we have all this dysfunction, ties back to campaign finance. If you ask the average person on the street, I think what bothers them most about the system, they'll tell you it's campaign finance. So we're going to start a two-part conversation today. The first part is going to be to examine kind of how we got here, what the main problems are, and then in the second part come back and talk about some solution sets. One of the things we always want to do on None of the Above is present solutions and options to hopefully deal with these situations. We're very lucky to have with us today Peter Wallison. In the world I travel in, which is the political world and the world of journalism and newspapers, for my money, he's an absolute rock star. Maybe not Britney Spears rock star like for my daughters, but he's a rock star. He holds the Arthur F. Burns Chair in Financial Policy Studies for the American Enterprise Institute. But among other things, I think Peter is as well known as anybody and as well written as anybody in understanding the financial crisis and the Great Recession. He is very knowledgeable because he spent a lot of his time in government. In fact, Peter, I'm realizing we could take up the whole 20-minute segment here on your career, so I'm going to shorten it a bit.
Good.
But I admire anyone that's spent time in government. I know we think it's dysfunctional, and it is dysfunctional, but the people working within government are a very hard-working group, and the people that have worked at the level that Peter's been at are incredibly brilliant. They're great at what they do. They're smart, and they're working to solve problems. We don't always feel that, but that's what they're doing. Peter served under President Reagan,
yes,
as Counsel of the President, and also served as General Counsel of the U.S. Treasury.
Yes.
I don't think you could have more eminent qualifications for what you do and what you represent. But we're going to throw a curveball today, because when I think of Peter and I think of his great work, I think of the financial crisis, I think of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and all the things you understand. But he's a very prolific writer, and somewhere along the way, he took a step back to write about campaign finance. And the book is called Better Parties, Better Government. So welcome, Peter Wallison.
Well, thank you,
and
Steve.
As I said, I had to cut the show short. That's not working either. I had to cut the show short. Say that 10 times fast to get through all your credentials. So welcome, and it's so great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, you, Steve. And I'd love to talk about campaign finance reform. It's a real vacation from the financial crisis in 2008.
Well, you must have taken a vacation to write the book. How do you have this whole world you live in, and then you just stop one day and say, I'm going to switch gears and move over to campaign finance reform?
Well, I was asked to be on a committee of the New York Bar Association on campaign finance. And at the time, there was another person on that committee by the name of Joel Gora, who was my co-author. Okay. Joel is a well-known lawyer. He's a professor at Brooklyn Law School and a member of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Commission, Union, ACLU. And he's been a student himself of campaign finance for many, many years. And it turned out, as we were both on this commission, that we agreed tremendously between the two of us. And I thought to myself, this is wonderful. He's a member of the ACLU. I am a Republican, a conservative, and we agree on campaign finance reform. Why is that? And is there a way for us to get together and discuss why we both view this issue the same way? And so we sat down in whenever it was, 2007, I think, and decided to write this book, and it was published in 2008.
Why was the Bar Association concerned with campaign finance reform?
Well, the New York City Bar Association has lots of subjects that they cover, and they set up these ad hoc committees of members to talk among themselves, to debate issues, and then perhaps to write a report of some kind. And Joel and I happened to be on that committee. There were only maybe 7 or 8 people on the committee. We met for about 6 months every month in New York, did a little bit of side research on our own, and then wrote a report. And Joel and I had, it turned out, exactly the same views. And why is that? And it turns out that Joel, and this should not surprise anyone from being a member of the ACLU, he is very strong on the First Amendment. He believes, as I believe, and this is where our joint views coincide, I believe that there's nothing more important in the First Amendment than providing as much information as we can to voters before an election. And what has happened, as we'll hope we will get into, what has happened over the years with campaign finance reform was the opposite. It was to deny voters as much information as could be done, because campaign finance reform is very favorable to incumbents. And who is making the laws on campaign finance reform? It's the incumbents. And they have been very fortunate because they've been supported in many respects by the press. And why is that? And that is because, to the extent that other sources of information to the public are limited, restricted in any way, the press has more power to influence what happens in public policy. So
that could be the sequel to this book, the press element. You don't really cover the press element.
We don't enough. We mention it in the in there the fact that this is really in the interest of the press to endorse as much campaign finance restrictions as they can in order to keep information from getting to the public from any source other than the press. And that actually has been the history of campaign finance. So Joel, who actually argued some of the major cases in the Supreme Court and in lower courts, and I wrote this book in 2008, 2007, and 2008 in order to make clear what we thought about campaign finance and what could be done to make it better. There are really two things here, Steve, that I want to emphasize. The first, I think, is that I am a very strong partisan of political parties. And I was interested to hear you saying before we got on the air that you're interested in a third party.
Right.
I think the problem is that the two political parties do not have enough power. Many people look today at what is happening in Congress, in the House and the Senate, and they are disgusted with the fact that there is so little agreement between the parties. They're so partisan. And the Republicans who come from parts of the country which are largely conservative will not compromise with the Democrats who come from parts of the country that are mostly liberal, and they actually can't. One of the reasons that is true is not, as many people say, redistricting within the states. That's part of it. One of the reasons it's true is that the parties have very little control over the people who are actually serving in office. And one of the reasons they have so little control is that they do not finance campaigns. They cannot finance campaigns. I would say that every one of your listeners would be surprised to learn that the political parties cannot finance the candidacies of their candidates, that the candidates have to raise the money themselves. The parties raise money, but the only substantial amounts that they can provide to the candidates turns out to be about 1% of the cost of a candidate's election. That small amount is limited by law. So the parties cannot actually help their candidates. The result of that is that the parties are not selecting people in various districts who could get elected. The interest of parties is to gain power by electing a majority in the House and the Senate. But they don't have the power to make sure who gets the nomination in a particular congressional district or in a state for the Senate. And they don't have the power because they can't provide the financing. It's the individual candidate who provides the financing. Now, I've only covered a little bit of this subject.
No.
Why don't you ask me?
I think your introductory comments are indicative of really how complex this whole topic is. And you glossed over a few things, and again, this is an educational program too, that maybe we should drill down a bit before we move on. When you talk about the financing, et cetera, there's a dichotomy between what they call hard money and soft money. Right? And the parties are on the soft money side.
No.
Or they're on the hard money side.
Hard money.
Okay, so why don't we walk through that?
Okay.
Hard money versus soft money, and where the players fall on that side of either side of that line.
The candidates themselves and the parties are limited to accepting and using only hard money.
Okay, which again is?
And that is, it's an individual restriction. You cannot give more than $2,400. I think that's the amount now. It's adjusted for inflation, and I think the number is now about $2,400 to any candidate. And you are limited in the amount that you can give to hard money that you can give to a political party or to a political committee of the party.
Okay.
Those numbers change almost daily because they're all adjusted for inflation, but they are small. In any event, though, the parties and the candidates are the only ones that can use, that are limited to hard money, and they can only use that hard money. The soft money, what you're referring to, are unlimited contributions that can be made to political action committees of various kinds, 527s, super PACs, various organizations under the Internal Revenue Code or under state laws that are permitted to solicit funds, sometimes disclosing who their donors are, sometimes not, but in unlimited amounts and not limited to the $2,400 for each
Right, and these limits, this hard money, that's the money that's used to basically say, vote for Joe, vote for Carol, vote for somebody. The actual, I want your vote expenditures.
Yes.
The soft money side is a little soft in how you can, but that's not targeted towards the candidate. It's more of an issue-based or get out the vote or things like that. It's not tied to vote for me.
That's right. In fact, the only distinction between hard money and soft money is that hard money is the only money that can be used to say vote for Joe Smith.
Right.
And if you say vote for Joe Smith, then it has to be said only with hard money.
Which is the limited sources of, as you said, an individual can give so much, a PAC could give so much. So there's limitations on the amount of money that can be given for on the hard money side, basically little, if any, limitations on the soft money side.
That's right. And so that represents a tremendous difference for parties as a group and these outside organizations that are like 527s and super PACs and so forth, who have much more money than the party. But even within the restrictions that the party has in financing its candidates, it is limited to a small amount of hard money that it can actually give to its candidates. A candidate for Congress, for example, can get only $5,000 from the Republican Party if he's running as a Republican, or the Democratic Party, $5,000. Direct contribution. Then there is something called coordinated money. That is, the party and the candidate can coordinate what they do, and that's something like $42,000. That amounts to about 1% of what it costs to run for Congress.
So again, and we're going to get to the solutions at the end, but where you agreed with your co-author is that the parties need to be able to have more of a say, more involvement in this. And right now, they're limited to the hard money side, and on the hard money side, they're greatly limited to even that level of participation.
That's right.
So they're narrowed. They're put in this little tiny box in terms of what they can do.
And why is that? And this is the thing that the book stresses so much. Why are the parties limited? Why did Congress, when it developed campaign finance law, why did it limit that? And the answer is, it's very helpful to incumbents. And when you think about it, of course, it becomes obvious. And that is, an incumbent has a myriad ways that he or she can introduce himself to his constituency. He has a franking privilege. He gets on television, on the local news all the time whenever he makes a statement of some kind. He goes around the district for the 2 years that he is, after he's been elected until the next election, to all of the county fairs and bar mitzvahs and other events that occur in his district, and he becomes very well known. There's name recognition for the person who's the incumbent. What about the challenger? Where does he get the money? That's the problem. Right. And what Congress knew when it established the campaign finance laws was that if the candidates themselves had to raise all the money, then it was going to be much easier for the incumbent to raise the money. He's already well known. He already has introduced himself to all of the interests who would be interested in his vote. He's known to people in the district, and they might be contributors also. But the challenger, how does he start out? And in fact, he starts out with nothing in most cases. He can't get anything from his party, or at least anything substantial.
Very narrow range, right?
Very narrow range. So he has to not only make himself well known, which is the incumbent already has done, but he's got to raise the money from the very beginning of the campaign. So if the campaign begins the year before the election, which is rare, it usually begins about 4 to 6 months before the election, the poor challenger who has finally gotten the party's nomination and is ready to run against the incumbent has to now start soliciting funds from people in the district and people he knows throughout the country in order to put up any kind of campaign against the incumbent. And so since the campaign finance reforms went into effect in 1974, and they've been amended a little bit
Right.
since then, the advantage of the incumbent over the challenger has risen. It was almost 1-to-1 before the campaign finance reforms went into effect. Now it's 5 or 6 to 1.
Right, and you say
in favor
1-to-1,
of
the amount of money that was
the
being
amount
raised.
of money that each of them could raise
Now
was
the
almost
incumbents,
1-to-1.
what they're raising is just so huge.
Huge compared to what the challengers are able to raise. And even more important is that even when it's 5 or 6-to-1, the one for the challenger is late money. After he's worked or she's worked for months to raise the funds, it finally starts coming in, probably in September, maybe in October. The election's in
game's
November.
over.
The game is virtually over.
Right.
So for that reason, we have a system in this country where the incumbent is almost always elected. And so if you follow politics as you do, Steve, you know that the newspapers cover the fact that a single congressman, maybe not even a well-known person, but a single congressman has decided that he wants to spend more time with his family. Right. And he leaves office, and they say that. So that opens a spot in Iowa for the Republicans or the Democrats, depending on whether that congressman who departed is either one of those. Why is that so important? Well, when both candidates are starting off unknown, neither is an incumbent, each party has a better chance to win. So, one of the reasons we have these situations where the incumbents are in place, they are the only ones who the people in their district know, they are reelected in every case, they don't have to worry too much about opposition.
Right.
And so they tend to stay right within the most conservative or most liberal elements of the district, the people who come out to vote in the primaries and assure them then of re-election by nominating them for the party's nomination.
And that's where I think your book has such an interesting and different aspect, a different prism to focus on this whole problem. The average person on the street, and I'm overgeneralizing, they think of campaign finance reform. They say the system's rigged, people are buying votes, they're buying power, they're buying influence, the evil lobbyist thing going on here. You're looking past that. You're saying that's not even, in fact, in your book, you have research that shows that the money really doesn't lead to votes in that respect. Maybe we could you focus on that for a second?
Money is extremely important.
Right.
But
it's not showing up in the outcome of the voting that the candidates are making when they're elected.
Well, it actually shows up a little bit. What it shows,
but not to the extent that the average person is outraged, thinking that
that's right.
the money is yielding the voting results, as opposed to you said it's yielding the incumbency protection results.
Protection. That's right. The voting results are really a much different thing.
Right.
And people are outraged because what the press says is that, well, Congressman X received such and such contributions from the oil industry. And sure enough, he's voting in the way that the oil industry would want. Well, they never present the opposite point of view, which is the reason he's getting the money from the oil industry is that he has come into office voting in favor of the oil industry, and so they're supporting someone who supports their positions. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Everyone would say that's fine. If you think, however, that the oil industry is buying Congressman X's vote by making a contribution to him, well, then it looks a lot different. But the important point here, actually, is the fact that Congressman X has to go to the oil industry and ask for money. That's the point that I've been trying to make from the beginning, and that is if the party was the principal fundraising element,
then that wouldn't be happening.
And they made the contributions to their candidates, whether it's a challenger or an incumbent, there's much less of that appearance of corruption where the candidate has been required to solicit funds from an interest group of some kind.
And that's, again, I think what's so fascinating about your book, and when people read it, it breaks through this veneer that's out there of what people think the real problem is, and it starts focusing in a different direction. This notion of incumbency protection.
That's right.
Now, in the beginning, you started talking about the Supreme Court. They're not doing you many favors, because since your book was written, they keep going in the opposite direction. We have the Citizens United case, and we have the Speech Now case. So they're not working with you. They're working against you.
Not for parties. No, they're not. In fact, the two cases that they've handled, which were called Colorado 1 and Colorado 2, as a matter of fact, because the state of Colorado was involved in both of them, the Supreme Court, by 5-4.
I didn't know that, but both Colorado-based cases? Okay.
Yeah. It was a Colorado group that brought the case.
Okay.
In both cases, the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 majority, I must say, it's the the liberals on one side, the Republicans who were in the minority on this. In both cases, the Supreme Court held that contributions to parties could be limited by Congress, and not only the contributions to parties could be limited, but also the use by the parties of coordinated funds with their candidates could also be limited. So the parties are limited in a way that the organizations outside the political system, the 527s, the super PACs, those people who are raising unlimited funds for a variety of, because there are a variety of laws that permit them to do so, it gives them much more influence than the parties have. Because the parties...
And all in the name of free speech, though.
All in the name of free speech. And here's where it all comes together on the First Amendment and the issue of free speech. Because what is the First Amendment for? We have all kinds of disputes about whether some publication is pornographic or not, and whether a person can insult another person in the newspapers, and whether that is a libelous or a slanderous action for which he will be civilly liable. Those issues all involve the First Amendment, and they're hard fought on both sides. But the essential element of the First Amendment is to give the voters as much information as they can possibly have so they can make the right decision in electing their representatives, electing the president, the senators, and the congressmen. And so the reason Joel Gora and I came together so well is that he has been a First Amendment partisan for his entire career. And his view is that there ought to be as much information available, as much money as possible, as anyone wants to spend, to provide more information to the public, to the voters, before an election, to make sure the voters get as much information as they can possibly absorb, is the way the First Amendment was intended to work. And the campaign finance system goes in just the opposite way, because it attempts to limit the amount of information the voters can get by restricting the amount of money that candidates and parties can use to advertise what their candidate will do if he or she is elected.
So it's not as much about the money as how the money gets used, and again, it gets used so narrowly on the one side, and then within the party structure, even more narrowly. You want to open that up and free that up a bit so that the money can be spent differently and in a way that would promote competitiveness and break down this incumbency protection.
Exactly. If we had more challenging elections where incumbents were not always elected, we would have a much different Congress. And furthermore, we would have better people in Congress. You have to think about it this way, too. A whole lot of people who are really high-quality people. They are successful in their businesses. They are successful lawyers and doctors and people in the media and so forth. They don't want to be in politics because they know what that means is they have to go to everyone they know and beg for money in order to put on any kind of acceptable campaign against an incumbent. Very hard to do. Whereas if the parties were there to finance people, many people who are otherwise reluctant to enter the political system, who are very high quality and very intelligent people, would be willing to do it because the party will stand behind them, provide them with the money to run a good campaign.
And I think at the end of the day, that's probably the most frustrating thing for the average citizen, to say, this is the only choice I get. I only have a choice between A or B, and
Right.
I don't like A or B.
Right.
In fact, I want none of the above. All right. Well, anyway, this has been a very good start to our conversation. You see how fast time flies when we're
Is it all
having a
over
chat.
already?
All over already for the first segment. We're gonna have to turn this into 10 segments. I was gonna do 5, but it's really 10. 10 segments. So we'll break here, and then we'll regroup and come back with segment 2 in another show.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.